I wanted to thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I'm pleased to introduce historian Judith Tankard for this virtual lecture, Gardens of the Arts and Crafts Movement. This lecture coincides with the current exhibition, Arts and Craftsman, Simplicity, Honesty, and Truth to Materials at the Farmhouse Museum on Central Iowa State University campus, Ames, Iowa, which will be open through October 2022. The exhibition features prominent thinkers, artists, craftsmen, and companies, including theorist John Ruskin, designer William Morris, Tiffany Studios, Iowa College Art Pottery, the ceramic studios of Pewabic, Rookwood, Newcomb, Fulper, Van Briggle, Owens, and Weller, and of course the Roy Crofter Reformist community of craft workers based in East Aurora, New York. We've already had a program on Roy Croft, and so that is in our virtual database on YouTube if you were interested in learning more about the Roy Crofters. I'd also like to extend our sincere appreciation to Carol Pletcher from Ames for underwriting the exhibition and associated programming, as well as to our lenders to the exhibition, Lori Olk, Lynette and John Pullman, Chris Conklin, and myself. I'll now turn the focus over to Judith. Though the Farmhouse Museum does not have formal gardens, I felt this lecture would appeal to many as we are on the cusp of spring planting. For some of you that don't know, we're closer to the cusp of spring than we thought here in Iowa with some tornado outbreaks last night. If you weren't here, it was an interesting evening. But that is always a sign of almost time to plant and plant our gardens. So Judith Tankard is a landscape historian, author, and preservation consultant. She received an MA in art history from the Institute of Fine Arts, New York University, and taught at the Landscape Institute of Harvard University for over 20 years. In 2000, she was awarded the gold medal by the Massachusetts Horticulture Society for her role in the advancement of the historic New England gardens. She is a 2022 honorary member of the Garden Club of America. She has co-authored numerous books, including her most recent publication, Gardens of the Arts and Crafts Movement, which you can buy on Amazon or through Judith's website. Judith's articles and book reviews have been published in Antiques, Country Life, Horticulture, Landscape Architecture, Old House Interiors, and Pacific Horticulture, as well as other publications. And for 10 years, she served as editor of the Journal of the New England Garden Historical Society. In addition, she has prepared cultural landscape histories for the Garden Conservancy, Historic New England, and other organizations. Judith has a small garden on Martha's Vineyard where she says it's currently snowing, but her passion is visiting other people's gardens, both here and abroad. For future virtual programs relating to this exhibition, you can go to our website, museums.iastate.edu. This education program is also being recorded. So if you miss a part of it or want to revisit what Judith says, you can go on to our YouTube account probably later next week or the following for the recording of this lecture. We ask that you please reserve your questions for the conclusion of the lecture. Judith, the floor is yours.
Welcome. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be part of this lecture today. And I'll start off by saying greetings from Boston, where it's beautiful. It's almost spring today, but not quite. Some of you may recognize this icon of the arts and crafts movement in Britain. I'll start off by saying that my romance with the arts and crafts movement began over 50 years ago when I was a graduate student in art history at the Institute of Fine Arts in New York University. I came to England for a year and I visited a property called Standon, which was Philip Webb's extraordinary house in West Sussex. And now it's an arts and crafts mecca for architects, interior designers, garden lovers alike. Today, Standon is filled with Morris and Company furnishings, but however, in the late 1960s, it was still privately owned by the Beale family before being transferred to the National Trust in 1973. So after I returned to the United States, I continued to learn more and more about the arts and crafts movement and how it championed the unity of the arts. Art, architecture, interior design, and gardens were all considered a whole and not isolated entities. How it was not really a style, but it was really, as we all know, a philosophical approach to design with individual expressions as its guiding principles were simplicity and reverence for local traditions and materials. Well, as we all know, the movement itself was very short-lived, at least in Britain, from the 1880s until it fell out of favor around after World War I. But it left an enormous design legacy that still resonates today in Britain, the United States, and Europe, offering something for everyone, from architecture, interiors, and gardens to ceramics, textiles, wallpapers, jewelry, metalwork, and other crafts. Well, William Morris quickly became one of my heroes, and he still is today. His very famous house, Red House, was built in 1859 by Philip Webb. It was unlike any house before. It was steeped in medievalism with unusual for the time whitewashed interiors and surrounded by informal gardens and meadows. Well, William Morris famously quipped that many fine houses, both old and new, had been spoiled by bad gardens. Well, his garden, as we all know, provided inspiration for the firm's famous wallpapers, fabrics, and tapestries. And the firm's first wallpaper pattern, called the trellis, which you see here on the left, from 1864, was designed in collaboration with Philip Webb, who designed the birds, who drew the birds. And of course, we all know that Morris and Company wallpapers such as Blackthorn, which you can see on the right, to just pick one out of the dozens and dozens of papers, are still very popular today. Well, later on at Kelmscott Manor, which is a medieval manor house with storybook gardens, depicted in his book News from Nowhere in 1892, and also in a wonderful painting at the same time, William Morris would make these romantic, enchanting gardens. Today, Kelmscott Manor, and I hope many of you have been there. If you haven't, it's well worth the trip the next time you go to Britain, is now owned by the Society of Antiquaries, and it's filled to the gills with Morris and Company furnishing and a beautiful garden that brims with flowers. For many years, I thought the stone building on the far right was a dovecote, but it turns out that what it really is an outhouse, and it's disguised with these wonderful herbaceous borders that you can see in the lower right. Well, Morris, of course, inspired thousands and thousands of people, but he inspired others to take up the call for traditional buildings and handicrafts as a respite from life in smoke-filled industrial cities. And probably the most famous were the architects Ernest Jimson and the Barnsley brothers, who moved to the Cotswolds to set up furniture making shop. And they used the local limestone, beautiful limestone, to build their own individual houses. And this is just one of them, Ernest Jimson's tiny little house called Upper Dorval House, with its tiny enclosed garden in Sapperton Village. Sidney Barnsley's fanciful dovecote at Beach Hanger, as you can see on the left, and Jimson's dovecote, you can see on the right, were also built from the beautiful local limestone. Well, in addition to building their own houses, they completed a number of architectural commissions in the area, including a famous property called Cotswold Farm. It's a private house with a simple terrace garden that was designed by yet another member of their team, Norman Jewson. And it includes on the right, this stone garden house. Garden house had become one of the features that were part of the arts and crafts vocabulary in the Cotswolds. And why not, with a beautiful limestone, you would want to build as many buildings as possible to show it off. Well, in addition to building new houses in the old style, the group also renovated old manor houses, and probably one of the most famous is a property called Alpine Manor, with its garden enclosed by ancient yew trees that you can see in the picture, and also that high wall you're looking at is clipped yews from the 17th century. And also, if you look at the sketch plan on the left, you can see how the yews dominate the garden. The plan also shows the intimacy of the house and garden together. In fact, it's hard to tell exactly where the house ends and where the garden begins. The garden, in fact, functions as an outdoor room, which is one of the main principles of an arts and crafts garden. Well, Rodmartin Manor, however, is probably the most famous arts and crafts house and garden that was built during the era. And it was designed by Ernest Barnsley, and it was built, incredibly enough, over a 20-year period. And it includes this extraordinary garden. The house itself was completely outfitted with locally made furniture. Every single thing in the house was locally made. Nothing was bought. It made furniture, metalwork, tapestries, all the fabrics, the wall hangings, every single thing in the house was made locally. And then the plan on the right shows how the house was actually surrounded by a number of garden rooms, so you can barely tell where the house ends and the garden begins. The one nearest to the house is called the Winter Garden, the sunk garden, which you can see in the photo on the right. And two more garden rooms, one the double herbaceous long borders, which is so typical of Britain, with the Barnsley's beautiful garden house at the end of the vista, and clipped topiaries, more clipped topiaries on the right. As I said, it has 9 or 10 individual garden rooms. It's one of the most elaborate of all the arts and crafts gardens, often regarded. And the garden itself was inspired by a book of the time by John Setting. It was called Garden Craft, Old and New. It was published in 1890. It's well worth having a look for in a library or to buy online. Well, the good news is that Rodmartin is still owned by the same commissioning family, the Biddulph family. It's in the 4th or 5th generation by now, and it's open to the public. So when people start traveling again and you go to the Cotswolds, I can't recommend highly enough that you visit Rodmartin Manor. It's not a National Trust property, and it's open occasionally. Well worth planning your trip around when exactly it's open. Well, word soon spread about what was happening in the Cotswolds, and it inspired a younger generation of architects to take up their ideas in other parts of the country. So in the mid-1920s, a young architect named Oswald Mill designed a property called Colton Fishacre, which is located way down in Devon, as a summer home for the D'Oyly Carte family. It's the opera company, built entirely of local materials, as you can see from the photograph. The project includes informal stone terraces and numerous water features, such as the fish pond on the upper terrace that you can see on the far right, which is a much copied feature that you'll see in many arts and crafts gardens. And then, of course, the ubiquitous flower borders. The garden itself the property has acres and acres of naturalistic woodlands that lead down to the sea, and it's one of the treasures of the National Trust. Well, where did the arts and craft design philosophy actually come from? It's always a good question to ask. It always comes from somewhere else, as we know from style. So in the 1880s, We know that Britain began emerging from the heavy shroud of Victorian architecture to be replaced by more intimate houses that were designed by architects such as Richard Norman Shaw. The Shaw-inspired suburban villa that we see in this, depicted in Kate Greenaway's children's book, encapsulates this new approach to design with hedge-enclosed gardens. And if you look carefully, you can see the Morrison Company side chairs that the two young ladies are sitting in. This was also the era that rediscovered the so-called old-fashioned gardens that appealed to period artists like George Elgood, for instance, whose book, Some English Gardens, that he wrote with the famous co-author Gertrude Jekyll in 1906, championed old-fashioned cottage gardens, such as one called Cleve Prior that we can see on the left, with its astonishing yews and the bountiful flower borders. Lights Carey, which we're looking at on the right, is National Trust property in Somerset. Perfect example of an old-fashioned period garden with beautifully clipped topiaries. The old-fashioned garden represents one of the, as Setting wrote in his first book, the old-fashioned garden represents one of the pleasures of England and the quiet life of bygone times. Well, these gardens are beautiful today, yesterday, today, and beautiful always. So we do well to turn to them. And this is the important thing, not to replicate them, but to glean hints for our gardens today and drink of their spirit. Still excellent advice today. Well, Inigo Triggs was one of several young architects who studied the simple layouts of older gardens with distinctive architectural features and detailing that informed the establishment of the arts and crafts garden, and his lavish folio book called Formal Gardens of England and Scotland, published in 1902, included measured drawings of older gardens such as Montacute House in Somerset, a simple garden, but with beautiful garden features such as garden pavilions that inspired other architects and garden architects to replicate them in some of the new gardens they were featuring. And here we have the sketch and then a real-time photograph of what it actually looks like today. Topiary, or fanciful clipped hedges, became one of the key features in arts and crafts gardens, whatever their size, such as those at the 17th century Levens Hall, which is shown in Elgood's painting, which is up in the top right, and then a contemporary picture to show what it looks like today. It is open to the public. It's an extraordinary garden to visit. But of particular interest is the sketch plan on the left, showing that each one of the famous halls in Britain had their own distinctive topiary, and right dead in the center, you can see the one at Levens Hall. Walter Crane's picture book of 1899 depicted the essential vocabulary for this new garden, including the fanciful topiary with the peacocks. Well, Hidcote Manor, which I'm sure some of you have heard of, combines all the features of arts and crafts garden making. It was created by Lawrence Johnson over many years, beginning in 1912, modeled on period books, some of which I've already talked about, as well as Johnson's extensive travels that has over a dozen what we call rooms, such as the topiary garden on the left, and the so-called white garden on the right. In other words, the only flowers allowed in it were white blooming flowers, which later inspired Vita Sackville West at Sissinghurst Castle. Both of these are National Trust properties. And two more views of Hidcote. It's famous for its color themes, such as red borders that you can see on the left, and the red, it's not such a great shot to show the red borders, but the red really comes from the foliage and not from the color of the flowers. And then this incredible stilt garden on the right. Well, truth be told, most arts and crafts gardens are much smaller and not nearly as elaborate and complex as Hidcote, and instead focus on simple structuring, well-crafted details, medieval-inspired imagery such as topiary. But above all, the most important factor to remember is the harmonious relationship of house and garden. Well, founded in 1893, the Studio magazine focused on this new aesthetic with line drawings and attractive color renderings that you can see on the right here of houses and gardens and decorative arts. I'm sure all of you are familiar with this wonderful magazine, some of which, of course, are a bit unrealistic. The magazine featured the work of up-and-coming young architects such as Charles Rennie Mackintosh, Boise, Bailey Scott, and others who brought their own viewpoints to the movement. And of course, as we know, the first issue of the cover of the first issue of the Studio is designed by none other than Boise. Well, Mackintosh, of course, is pretty hard to slot in the arts and crafts movement since his vocabulary is so distinctive. At Hill House, he not only designed a revolutionary house, but he designed every piece of furnishing in the house, from furniture to metalwork to cutlery. And although we don't think of him as a garden designer, the garden itself is very simple. But his love of flowers was expressed later, much later in life, when he did those wonderful watercolors. And Boise, probably one of the most innovative architects working at the time, was of course known for his whitewashed houses such as Broadleys on Lake Windermere. Now, of course, a private yacht club where you can run as a B&B, where you can actually stay. This was an era when most architects like Boise and Mackintosh, Bailey Scott, and even Luncheons designed everything from light fixtures to gardens. Boise's vision for one of his houses is shown in this rendering in the Studio magazine. Typical whitewashed Boise house with a simple but imaginative garden. Another rendering shows one of his house with an imaginary meadow and flower garden with, incredibly enough, everything in bloom at once. And red flowers, if you look carefully, red flowers to match the roof and the red curtains fluttering in the windows. Boise, of course, is better known for his enchanting wallpapers and fabrics. He designed, when his short architectural career was over, a nursery fabric from the 1930s, depicts one of his houses surrounded by an imaginary Garden of Eden with birds and flowers and rats, and sumptuous garden features on the right, such as the sundial and the peacock. It's all there. Bailey Scott is another creative architect and artist associated with the arts and crafts movement in Britain, and his renderings, such as this garden pergola, regularly appeared in the Studio magazine and also in his own book called Houses and Gardens, published in 1906. Well worth having a look at. Blackwell in Windermere, not far at all from the boathouse that Boise did. As many of you know, is now a major arts and crafts museum. It's probably his most famous house. Although the parterre garden, it would have been in the foreground, has now long since vanished. But the important thing is the interior is filled with decorative art, such as wall coverings and a fire dog, all with these incredible floral motifs. So he brings the arts and crafts garden from the outdoors into the interior of the house. It's all part of the arts and crafts garden. Well, Bailey Scott's garden at Snows Hill Manor, which is a very famous National Trust property in Snows Hill Village, was an excellent example of an arts and crafts garden, which shows a whole series, as you can see from the plan, a whole series of courtyards, new courtyards that link an old rambling manor house with ancient farm buildings, including a medieval dovecote that you can see on the far right, all on sloping ground. And just a couple of pictures to show well court on the left, Armillary Court on the right, flower borders. It's basically new gardens with old features. As I said, this is a National Trust property. It's well worth having a look at when you're traveling in Britain. And now on to the most famous design team of the arts and crafts era, Gertrude Jekyll, whom we'll hear more about later, and the architect Edwin Lutyens. Their collaboration in the early 1900s produced some of the best examples of arts and crafts houses and gardens, most of which were featured in Country Life magazine and well known at the time. This is some vintage pictures of Marsh Court in Hampshire, which was built with white chalk and red tile trim and black flint detailing. So the gardens, hugging house include, on the left, you can see this incredible water garden flanked by Jekyll style borders. And below that, there was a pergola and a pool, all of which are standard Lutyens and Jekyll features. It was a boys' school for many, many decades, and you can imagine the gardens were completely and totally run down. It's now privately owned by an American couple, and the gardens have been recently rehabilitated by Reed Hildebrand landscape architects. Lutyens, who excelled in clever details, extended the checkerboard theme that we saw in the garden to the paving and to the sundial and all these clever little features that were part of the arts and crafts garden. Well, Folly Farm is probably their best known and most ambitious project, and it was carried out between 1906 and 1912. Lutyens and Jekyll created a series of hedged rooms, including a canal garden that you can see in a vintage Country Life picture on the left, and then as recently restored by Dan Pearson Studios on the right. It's extremely private. Today, here are two more views of a so-called blue and purple parterre. And then two more pictures to show yet another water garden at Folly Farm, a loggia, and the tank garden. It was one of their most exquisite projects, and they worked on it for nearly a dozen years. Hestercombe Gardens in Somerset is probably one of their team's most visible gardens. But it's important to remember it's a large classical garden, but it has arts and crafts details. Unfortunately, it has no arts and crafts house to go with it, only a homely Victorian mansion. So we're standing with our back to the mansion and looking over this great, immense garden. It's open to the public. It's well worth a detour. It's located in Somerset. And here we have what's called the Great Plat, looking out onto the elaborate water garden with Jekyll borders on the left and the right. This is the water rill system. We have a rill on the left, and there's a companion rill on the right, and then a pergola, discontinuous pergola It looks out over the Somerset Hills. But part of the charm of Hester Combe are these wonderful arts and crafts details that were picked up by other architects throughout the era. The pools with the spouting mask, as you can see on the left, and their so-called mirror pool on the right are just two of many dozens of details at Hester Combe. And then, of course, the ubiquitous plantings. Fortunately, a full set of plans were discovered, planting plans were discovered in the 1970s for Hester Combe. And in more recent years, the gardens have been completely restored. They're open to the public all the time. It's not a National Trust private property, but it's open to the public and well worth a detour. They're in Somerset. And here a final view with one of the most magnificent pergolas ever designed by Luncheons. If you look carefully, you can see that he was doing one of his little jokes with alternating circular piers on the left and rectangular piers for the pergola on the right, all covered with Jekyll's favorite climbers. At Great Dixter, which was the Lloyd family's famous garden in Sussex, Luncheons remodeled the buildings and defined the grounds. Many of you will be familiar with the Great Dixter for Christopher Lloyd's famous gardens here. Jekyll, unfortunately, had nothing to do with this garden, but Great Dixter is famous for Luncheons' what Luncheons did at this garden, connecting one garden room to another with his steps, arches. It's an incredible complex, all with arts and crafts detailing. Well, the arts and crafts approach to design quickly spread beyond the borders to Scotland and Wales. And Robert Lorimer, who was a contemporary of Luncheons, planned extensive new gardens at a property called Earl's Hall, a 16th century castle in Fife that's shown on the upper plan by Inigo Triggs again. He planted full-grown topiaries on the right to give it an instant mature look. He also laid out a smaller, less complex walled garden at Kelly Castle, a National Trust property, to evoke an earlier era. Here we have dense flower borders, period ornament. If you look carefully on the far right, you can see what's called an armillary sphere. Decorate the garden is shown in the Elgood painting, which is up in the upper left. Robert Lorimer thought that the garden should be in tune with the house. As he said, a sort of a sanctuary where one could shut oneself out from the world. H.A. Tipping, who was the architectural editor of Country Life, which featured many of these new houses and gardens, brought the arts and crafts approach to design to Wales in a series of homes he designed, including this one called High Glenelg in the 1920s. It's privately owned today. The gardens have been completely restored and it's often open to the public. And here's a charmer called Wincliffe Court, located not far away. Tipping designed this classic arts and crafts garden, a small sunken garden with all the features, topiary, pools, water features, and a classic garden pavilion. And then finally, just Clough Williams Ellis was probably the last of the great architects to take up the cause of the arts and crafts movement. An artist by nature, he was fascinated by rural architectural traditions. Located on the coast of Snowdonia in Wales, he designed a garden of rooms surrounded his old ancestral homestead called Florence. Although it comes late in the game, it's definitely arts and crafts in spirit. Frank Lloyd Wright, who was Welsh by nature, made a famous trip to visit him here. And here we have two more vignettes. So these just show all the different aspects of a so-called arts and crafts garden in Britain. And now a word from the artist gardeners who made the arts and crafts garden a reality. William Robinson and Gertrude Jekyll were near contemporaries, although he got his start in the 1870s when he started writing books, including The Wild Garden, which promoted the use of native rather than exotic plants in English gardens, and his home was Alpine Manor, which was not an arts and crafts property, obviously. It was Elizabethan in origin. At one time, it was surrounded by 1,000 acres of bucolic fields and woodlands. And today, of course, it's a luxury relais chateau hotel. The gardens have been recently rejuvenated by a wonderful gardener named Tom Coward. But Robinson is important because he was a writer who provided the essential horticultural element, which he thought was missing from architects' gardens that we've been looking at, which he in fact despised, as well as topiary, which he called vegetable sculpture. A period painting that shows grave tie, house and garden as it was in Robinson's day. And like Munstead Wood, many artists came to Gravetye to paint the renowned gardens, including one artist named Alfred Parsons, who was also another arts and crafts garden designer, whose work includes, who designed a few gardens in Britain, including Great Sheffield Manor and Whittock Manor, both of them National Trust properties. Another artist, Beatrice Parsons, who famously painted Gravetye summer borders that you can see on the far left, and the incomparable woodland gardens at hundreds and hundreds of acres of woodlands. Not for nothing was she called Queen of the Blazing Border. And then Gertrude Jekyll, of course, probably needs little introduction. She was an architect, she was an artist by training. It was a one-woman arts and crafts movement, I like to say. She was a painter, an embroiderer, metalworker, woodworker, photographer, and much, much more before she even turned to gardening and writing in midlife when she was in her late 40s, early 50s. She famously met William Morris in 1869 when she was in her embroidery phase. So her famous home, Munstead Wood, was built in 1896, and it set off a collaboration with Luncheons, with houses and gardens they designed together, known the world over. But at the heart of it, she was a plant lover, and Munstead Wood was filled with seasonal gardens and borders. We're looking at the woodland walk, looking towards the house. Two period illustrations of her famous color-themed 200-foot long June border. On the left, a painting by Helen Allingham, one of many paintings that she made at Munstead Wood. And then on the right, a rare color, an autochrome, showing the center segment of that beautiful border that she designed. And then just one more area of Munstead Wood. There were probably 10 different seasonal areas. I'm showing the Michaelmas Daisy border on the left is painted by Helen Allingham again. And then a photo as it was recreated a number of years ago. Well, one of Gertrude Jekyll's best known gardens is the impeccably restored manor house at Upton Grave. It's located in Hampshire. It was originally designed for the editor of the Studio magazine. A garden of rooms is featured, a parterre garden that you can see on the left, with low stone walls and luscious roses, and more roses and hollyhocks. The present owner followed the planting plans from the Gertrude Jekyll archives and perfectly emulated Gertrude Jekyll's magical style. It's a wonderful place to visit, in Manor House at Upton Gray, located in Hampshire. Wonderful place to visit in late May, early June if you're in Britain. Well, the person who actually combined horticulture and design expertise was Thomas Mawson. He was the one who brought landscape design into the professional realm around 1900. His family owned a nursery in the Lake District, and after learning drafting skills, he launched his landscape design career. And he spread the word about the profession of landscape architecture in his very popular book, The Art and Craft of Garden Making, first published in 1900, and it went through about 5 or 6 different editions. The neat thing about this book is he wrote it for his clients in order to tell them the scope of what he could, of the things that he could do for them. It also turned out, this book turned out to be as important as Gertrude Jekyll's book, Gardens for Small Country Houses, that she wrote with Lawrence Weaver in 1912. In his book, he included as a first, he included professional plans, photographs, and beautiful watercolor renderings like those we're seeing on the screen that illustrated all his points, and he hoped to entice his clients into ordering. It's still one of the best period books on the subject. Well, most of his work was in the Lake District, such as Langdale Chase, which is now a hotel, and the gardens are pretty much a garden of shrubs. And then at Graithwaite Hall, which is another property nearby, he laid out a landscape with drives and woodland gardens, very extensive. But it has this rare topiary garden that was designed by Thomas Mawson. And finally, Different Gardens, which is located in Wales, is another National Trust property. It's one of his most visible commissioned today. And that kind of wraps up the British scene. And now to more familiar territory, to say that the message of the English arts and crafts approach to design was highly influential around the world, especially obviously in the United States, where it took on more regional identities and focused more on architecture and decorative arts rather than on garden designer. Its most lasting contribution was in architecture and crafts such as ceramics, metalwork, furniture, as well as the establishment of arts and crafts communities and societies, such as Elbert Hubbard's Roycroft in East Aurora, New York, and Gustav Stickley's Craftsman Farms in New Jersey. And Stickley, who sometimes is regarded as the American William Morris, was influential on middle-class Americans, offering them home building and garden making advice through his wonderful magazine I'm sure all of you collect, called The Craftsman. He promoted natural gardens as opposed to, quote, rich man's gardens that were ostentatious. Well, I'd like to tell you a little bit about this garden in Short Hills, New Jersey, that was designed by William Wetton Renwick, nephew of his more famous James Renwick. Created a seminal house and garden in the 1920s called Pleasant Days, with acres of design garden grounds, including a so-called Garden of the Gods, which we see in this vintage autochrome, with a pool and statuary. The house is now gone, but the extensive gardens included Renwick's rustic stone-built tea houses with incredible rookwood tiles. The property is now known as Greenwood Gardens. It's located in Short Hill, New Jersey, as I said, An extraordinary arts and crafts garden with nature trails and currently a preservation project of the Garden Conservancy. Recommended highly for a visit. Well, young American architects were often swept away by their English contemporaries whose work they learned about through books and magazines heralding the new style, as opposed to the large Gilded Age mansions. And Chicago, as we know, was a hotbed of the arts and crafts movement, from the formation of the Chicago Arts and Crafts Society in 1897 to individual architects such as Frank Lloyd Wright. But Howard Van Doren Shaw is not so well known, a local architect who designed country houses in Lake Forest, Illinois, was a devoted follower of the British arts and crafts movement, and his house, Ragdale, vaguely resembles the Boise house, but it is now a writer's retreat. It was originally, the property in 1897 was originally surrounded by apple orchards and meadows, harking back to William Morris's Red House. Small kitchen garden with a grape harbor, wellhead, sundial, and an English-inspired dovecote that you can see on the right. And then in California, obviously, the arts and crafts movement took on a distinctive regional identity. The Green and Green brothers, who were interesting enough, were the exact contemporary of the Barnsley brothers in England, established themselves as preeminent architects specializing in bungalow style houses with exquisite furniture. And one of the most famous, of course, is the Gamble House with its garden-inspired decorative motifs. But one property that's probably not so well known in Woodside, California. Charles Sumner Green designed Green Gables in 1911. Extraordinary water gardens, now considered the largest garden in the country, designed by an arts and crafts architect. Rustic stonework carried out in the paths and planters. Green Gables, which was a preservation project of the Garden Conservancy, I understand now is on the market. Well, American regionalism in the arts and crafts movement comes into play on the East Coast in the form of art colonies, featuring so-called old-fashioned gardens, such as the home and studio of the American sculptor Augustus St. Gaudens in Cornish, New Hampshire, being a prime example. And here we have a very simple parterre filled with traditional New England plants. The artist Stephen Parrish's garden in Cornish, shown in the artist's own painting on the left, and a period image showing his niece in the garden, brimming once again with those beautiful hollyhocks. And another example of the Lyme Art Colony in Old Lyme, Connecticut. Today, obviously, it's the Florence Grizzle Museum, is the oldest colony in the United States. In its day, it attracted Child Hassam and other important artists. These so-called old-fashioned gardens represent just yet another arm of the influential arts and crafts movement and its influence on gardens. And finally, the topiary element sometimes finds a whimsical expression in gardens, such as the famous topiary hunt scene at Ladue Gardens in Moncton, Maryland. Well, in just a few minutes, I'd like to turn briefly to some of the new gardens that have been inspired by the arts and crafts movement and show how the concept of harmonious house and garden continues to influence today's garden designers on both sides of the pond. Great Foster's is the gardens at Great Foster's in Surrey, jumping back to Britain, were laid out in 1918 and include immaculate topiary, as you can see on the left, and a knot garden, as well as a beautiful rose archery on the right. It's now a luxury hotel, and the gardens have been rigorously maintained, including a recent update by the famous British landscape architect Kim Wilkie, who's added new areas as well as preserved the old gardens. Highly recommend that you stay there and look out the window at that wonderful view. And then Sir Roy Strong's former garden at the Lasket on the Welsh borders was probably one of the most significant formal gardens created in recent years in Britain. It was laid out as a series of interlocking hedged rooms and served as a showcase for Sir Roy's monuments and artifacts that he collected over the years as an art historian. The garden has statue-lined walks, small buildings, fountains, and much, much more, but very few flowers. It owes its inspiration to many sources, including the Arts and Crafts Garden. And the gardens at Bryan's Ground were created around an arts and crafts house by David Wheeler, who is the editor of Hortus magazine, and his partner Simon Dorrell, who's the artist who's drawn all the plans that you've been seeing on the screen and also in my book. It spent 25 years remaking, remodeling, and enlarging the garden. That includes a traditional formal garden, an orchard, an arboretum, and more. And here we see the sunk garden and two more incredible views of showing the influence of the arts and crafts garden on today's contemporary gardens. York Gate is another wonderful example in a quiet suburb near York in Yorkshire. Remarkable for its small scale, ingenious planning, architectural detailing. Some of the hardscaping, which is really incredible, is recycled materials. The 2-acre garden combines ordered geometry in its planning and a diversity of foliage and texture in its planting. It designed in the 1950s, but still influenced by the arts and crafts movement. And then Helen Dillon's world famous former garden in Dublin expresses her passion for combining plants for color and texture with a nod to Gertrude Ziegel, although completely different. She has a brand new garden now north of Dublin that's even more exquisite than her former one. So they're all different aspects of the arts and crafts movement. Here's another example, Wollerton Old Hall, which is located in Shropshire. It's a series of one of England's finest gardens, consisting of a series of outdoor rooms, each one more breathtaking than the next, and owes much to the principles of the arts and crafts garden. Ginny Blom, who is a contemporary artist gardener in Britain, responsible for a number of very sensuous gardens that are very uniquely hers. Exquisite plantings, judicious supporting features. And probably one of the most important recent undertakings in America is Hollister House, which is located in Northwest Connecticut, a 6-acre garden, skillfully combining ingenious layout and storied plantings based on art historian George Golkoff's visits to English gardens. It consists of a series of parterres on sloping terrain, each with a different focus and exhibition of planting expertise. 2 images there, and beautiful image of the borders, excellent example of the basic lessons of arts and crafts garden planning. Also a preservation project of the Garden Conservancy. Hollister House is often open to the public and hosts a number of educational programs. And last but not least, I'd love to show this picture of Bill Noble's Informal garden in Vermont. It was laid out with an artist's eye for planting combination based on years of gardening expertise, plus exposure to some of America's finest gardens as the former director of preservation projects at the Garden Conservancy. The garden is occasionally open to the public. And finally, no discussion of the arts and crafts garden is complete without mention of its most famous symbol, the Luncheons Bench. It's seen in gardens the world over. It made its first appearance at Munstead Wood. You can see in the black and white picture in the upper left in the 1890s, and can be found in gardens all over the world. Well, this is just a very brief introduction to, as you can see, a complex history of the arts and crafts garden, its origins, designers, characteristics, influence. It offers really a personal selection based on my years of research and travel and extensive garden library. The book offers many more themes and designers, plus a list of over 100 places to visit, including dozens and dozens of National Trust properties that are open to the public. If you're interested, if you can't find a copy locally in your bookseller, you can always contact me at judith@tankard.net.
Well, thank you, Judith. That was fantastic. And I think we're all inspired by those lush green sites. Some of us are in still the bridge of winter into spring. And I know you've probably inspired a lot of us to go back and tour the beautiful gardens of England as well.
Oh, don't we all want to get on that plane and go?
Exactly. I think we should just, make a point of it, and we'll take your book as a guidebook.
Right.
Does anyone have any questions for Judith? And we'll just spend a few minutes because I know we're at the 3 o'clock mark, but maybe 5-10 minutes for questions. Silence. See, you did such a complete job, Judith. There are no questions.
I've had that happen before. Like
I have one.
So much, I should leave a few questions out. How to find the list of plants?
Yep.
I'm reading something in the chat.
Correct. It was, where do you find
went away.
A list of plants or a reference book that may be appropriate to the era?
People often ask me about the plants, and the plants really have almost exactly nothing to do with the arts and crafts garden. It's all about design. It's about the ornament. It's about design. If you can use any plants, the plants really have nothing to do with it.
Excellent. Well, and I just saw a quick note from Susan that it is in our Ames Public Library. So if you're in the Ames area, you can check out Judith's book in the library. Otherwise, it's on her website. It's on Amazon. I'm sure maybe you get a better cut if we get it off of your website.
You get a good deal on Amazon and they ship it overnight.
Yeah. Any other questions? What role did sculpture play in the gardens?
Oh, the sculpture, that's a whole nother lecture.
Okay, then never mind.
Sculpture was very, very important, especially in the American element, especially in the gardens of the Cornish art colony and the work of Ellen Shipman. There was really a garden that she designed that didn't have sculpture in it. Sculpture became very important, and it was good to have regional sculptors doing it, not anymore, but something that worked with the house and the garden. And it could be figurative, or it could be vases, whatever. If you look carefully at many of the pictures, like that armillary that was in the Robert Lawrence garden, that's exactly what we were looking at. Nothing Baroque, nothing Italian. Would have to be regional. British or American.
Well, a lot of focus on sundials and birdhouses.
Yes, yes, I know. Everybody needs a dovecote, I'm sure.
Well, there was sculpture in those topiaries too. Some of them were stunning with birds on top. Yes.
Yeah, you don't see so many topiaries in the U.S.
No, no.
The
I think
Midwest in particular, but
we would have to bring over some
element
experts.
in the British part was that I often get lots of questions about the topiary, and it's so suited for England, but not obviously for here, except for the wonderful example that I showed at the Greenwood Garden with the scene. You rarely see topiary, but it was part of the scene in the 1890s.
Somebody asked where you can find the recording. That will be on our University Museum's YouTube account. Alicia, whom I want to thank for running the lecture today, she'll probably need a few days, if not a week, to do some editing for the YouTube presentation. But we will definitely make that post, and hopefully by maybe next weekend, you can check back and see the recording of this lecture. And I think we're going to probably wrap up the questions and let Judith go on with her snowy day. We really enjoyed your lecture, Judith. And again, you've inspired us to travel, whatever that means to people, and plant lush gardens of the arts and crafts movement era. Again, thank you so much. And we enjoyed everyone's presence, and thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye.